The Reshaping of the Middle East, a descent into perpetual strife. The Middle East, a region steeped in ancient history, religious significance, and geopolitical importance, has been a crucible of conflict and transformation for centuries. However, the aftermath of World War II marked a pivotal turning point, one that reshaped the region in ways that continue to reverberate today. The collapse of colonial empires, the rise of nationalism, and the imposition of foreign powers' interests laid the groundwork for a series of events that would lead to the creation of the State of Israel, the displacement of millions, and the ignition of enduring tensions. This essay delves into the dark legacy of post-World War II Middle East, exploring how the region was carved up, how Israel emerged as a nation, and how these events sowed the seeds of unending conflict. Now, before we move on with the story, please help a small channel grow. Like and subscribe. It means a lot to me. Okay, back to the story. The collapse of empires and the rise of new borders. World War II left the global order in shambles. The once dominant European powers, particularly Britain and France, emerged from the war weakened and financially drained. Their empires, which had stretched across the Middle East, were no longer sustainable. The region, previously under Ottoman rule until the end of World War I, had been divided into mandates by the League of Nations, with Britain and France assuming control. These mandates, however, were not designed with the interests of the local populations in mind. Instead, they were drawn to serve the strategic and economic interests of the colonial powers. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret pact between Britain and France, had already laid the groundwork for arbitrary borders that ignored ethnic, religious, and tribal divisions. Post-World War II, these borders became formalized as the mandates transitioned into independent states. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine were all products of this colonial cartography. The consequences of these artificially constructed nations were profound. Ethnic and religious groups were forced into uneasy coexistence, often under the rule of authoritarian regimes that relied on repression to maintain control. The seeds of sectarianism and internal strife were sown, as these states lacked the organic social cohesion necessary for stability. The Zionist movement and the birth of Israel. Amidst this turbulent backdrop, the Zionist movement gained momentum. Zionism, which emerged in the late 19th century, sought to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a region with deep historical and religious significance for Jews. The horrors of the Holocaust during World War II galvanized international support for the Zionist cause, as the world grappled with the atrocities committed against the Jewish people. The United Nations, in 1947, proposed a partition plan for Palestine, which would divide the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, but the Arab states and the Palestinian Arab population rejected it outright. For the Arabs, the partition plan was seen as a grave injustice. Palestine, which had been predominantly Arab for centuries, was being divided to accommodate a Jewish state, despite the fact that Jews constituted a minority of the population. The plan was perceived as a continuation of colonial interference, with Western powers imposing their will on the region without regard for the indigenous population. In May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Almost immediately, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded the newly declared state, sparking the First Arab-Israeli War. The war ended in 1949 with an Israeli victory and the expansion of its territory beyond the borders proposed by the UN partition plan. However, the war also resulted in the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, who fled or were expelled from their homes. This mass exodus, known as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, remains a central issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as the descendants of these refugees continue to demand the right of return. The Cold War and the polarization of the Middle East. The creation of Israel coincided with the onset of the Cold War, a global struggle for influence between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Middle East, with its strategic location and vast oil reserves, became a battleground for superpower rivalry. The United States, seeking to counter Soviet influence in the region, aligned itself with Israel, providing it with military, economic, and diplomatic support. This alliance was driven by a combination of strategic interests and domestic political considerations, including the influence of the American Jewish community. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, sought to cultivate alliances with Arab states, particularly those that espoused socialist or pan-Arab ideologies. Egypt under Jamal Abdel Nasser, for example, became a key Soviet ally, receiving arms and economic aid in exchange for its opposition to Western influence in the region. This polarization exacerbated existing tensions, as the Arab-Israeli conflict became intertwined with the broader Cold War struggle. The region became a proxy battlefield, with conflicts such as the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Six-Day War of 1967 drawing in superpower involvement and further destabilizing the Middle East. The Six-Day War and its aftermath. The Six-Day War of 1967 was a watershed moment in the history of the Middle East. In a preemptive strike, Israel launched a devastating attack on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, capturing the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The war was a humiliating defeat for the Arab states and a decisive victory for Israel, which now controlled territories that were home to millions of Palestinians. The occupation of these territories marked the beginning of a new phase in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel's settlement policies in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which involved the construction of Jewish settlements on occupied land, were widely condemned by the international community as a violation of international law. These settlements not only displaced Palestinian communities but also created facts on the ground that made the prospect of a two-state solution increasingly remote. For the Palestinians, the 1967 war deepened their sense of dispossession and fueled the rise of armed resistance movements, such as the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, sought to achieve Palestinian self-determination through both political and military means. However, their tactics, including acts of terrorism, further entrenched Israeli hostility and led to cycles of violence that continue to this day. The rise of political Islam and the Iranian Revolution. While the Arab-Israeli conflict dominated the headlines, another transformative force was emerging in the Middle East: political Islam. The failure of secular Arab nationalism, exemplified by the defeat of Nasser's Egypt in the 1967 war, led to a crisis of legitimacy for Arab regimes. In this vacuum, Islamist movements gained traction, offering an alternative vision rooted in religious identity and resistance to Western influence. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a seismic event that reshaped the region's political landscape. The overthrow of the Shah, a close ally of the United States, and the establishment of an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, marked the triumph of political Islam. The revolution inspired Islamist movements across the Middle East, challenging the dominance of secular regimes and introducing a new ideological dimension to regional conflicts. Iran's revolutionary regime also positioned itself as a staunch opponent of Israel, providing support to militant groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. This alignment further complicated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it became enmeshed in a broader struggle between Iran and its rivals, including Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. The sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims, exacerbated by the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, added another layer of complexity to the region's conflicts. The Oslo Accords and the illusion of peace. In the early 1990s, there was a glimmer of hope for peace in the Middle East. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 between Israel and the PLO, were hailed as a breakthrough. The Accords established the Palestinian Authority and envisioned a gradual process toward Palestinian self-governance in the West Bank and Gaza. However, the Oslo process was deeply flawed. It failed to address core issues such as the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the future of Israeli settlements. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by a Jewish extremist dealt a severe blow to the peace process. Subsequent Israeli governments, particularly under Benjamin Netanyahu, pursued policies that undermined the prospects for a two-state solution. The expansion of settlements, the construction of a separation barrier, and the imposition of blockades on Gaza fueled Palestinian resentment and eroded trust in the peace process. The failure of Oslo was starkly illustrated by the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, a violent uprising that resulted in thousands of deaths on both sides. The Intifada marked a return to armed struggle for many Palestinians, while Israel responded with harsh military measures, further entrenching the cycle of violence. The 21st century, a region in perpetual crisis. The 21st century has brought no respite for the Middle East. The US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified on the pretext of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, unleashed chaos that destabilized the entire region. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime created a power vacuum that was filled by sectarian militias and extremist groups, including the rise of ISIS. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, further plunged the region into turmoil, drawing in regional and global powers and resulting in a humanitarian catastrophe. Meanwhile, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unresolved. Gaza, under the control of Hamas, has become a besieged enclave, subjected to repeated military offensives by Israel. The West Bank, fragmented by settlements and checkpoints, is a tinderbox of tension. The Trump administration's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and the normalization agreements between Israel and some Arab states have further marginalized the Palestinian cause. Conclusion: a legacy of division and despair. The reshaping of the Middle East after World War II was a process marked by foreign intervention, arbitrary borders, and the imposition of external agendas. The creation of Israel, while fulfilling the aspirations of the Jewish people, came at the expense of the Palestinian population, whose displacement and suffering continue to fuel the conflict. The Cold War rivalry, the rise of political Islam, and the failure of peace initiatives have all contributed to a region mired in perpetual crisis. The Middle East today is a landscape of shattered dreams and unending strife. The promise of self-determination and sovereignty has been eclipsed by the realities of occupation, authoritarianism, and sectarian violence. The legacy of post-World War II decisions looms large, a reminder of how the ambitions of great powers and the neglect of local aspirations can lead to decades of suffering. As the region grapples with its demons, the hope for a just and lasting peace remains elusive, buried beneath the weight of history and the scars of countless wars. Thank you for watching my video. Please like and subscribe.